Well, good morning, guys. We are getting back into things as we dig into actually the last study of a 4-week series that we've been in. And looking around the room, I think most of us have been here, but just in case, basically, we're looking at what we've been calling monsters or things that trip us up, lock us up, put us into bondage, and keep us from living out our faith in the way that God calls us to live out our faith. And so far, we have covered three main topics so far. We covered pride, as we looked at the testimony of Obadiah, which is one of the minor prophets. That's who we've been looking at to be able to speak into areas that people are struggling with and what God's had to say through them. We looked at fear as we dug into Haggai and the message that was there. Last week we looked at lust with Hosea, and again, lust is talking more than just sexual lust. Lust is talking about any area of our life where I want what I want, and that trumps whatever anything else is going on, including what God wants. And so we looked at all three of those and went pretty in depth into each one. I think most of us have a general idea of what those topics are, so I think we can move on in the general ballpark for the fourth one that brings these three together. But again, if you want to go back and get into those, we always have the audio and video podcast available on the church website. If you like video, you can get it at tomhypes.com. There's a lot of different places. If you're using Right Now Media at home, there's a Shepherd's Fellowship page on there that you can get that as well. So it's all there. If there's a particular area that you either feel like you're struggling with, or there's a particular area that you don't think you're struggling with, but in all honesty, usually we don't realize we're struggling with, that you want to go back and look at. But today is kind of, I don't know if I really want to call it the granddaddy of the four, but I will, for lack of a better term, because it is its own monster, but it's also what the other three lead to. So it doesn't necessarily stand alone. All three of these will lead into this fourth monster, which is basically just this: inaction. Not living the life that God's called you to, not taking the faith steps that maybe He's challenging you with, not living in obedience in areas that sees in the Scripture of what He calls us to so we can have freedom, but how these things lead into us either consciously or unconsciously saying no to the Lord and keep us from moving forward into Him. As we're going to find in this particular testimony in the minor prophets, pride, fear, lust, and inaction, and see how all these work together. So if you would, let's go ahead and get out our Bibles. We're going to get right into it. We're going to go to Jonah chapter 1 and look at the story. I think most of us are pretty familiar, kind of casually at least, with Jonah, because when we were growing up, especially if you grew up in church or in VBS, you probably have read the fascinating cartoon version of Jonah, or you have seen it played out in movies or in plays. And if you like talking vegetables, you probably enjoyed the VeggieTale version of it at some point or another. But there's usually a little bit more to Jonah than what we usually get, because a lot of times we really like to focus on Jonah's chapter 1 through 3, and we kind of stop short and don't dig into chapter 4 that much. And I think it's important that we get at least a casual glance today at the full story, and then, of course, invite you to be able to go home and dig deeper into all 4 chapters together as well. Now, with Jonah, one of the things that we sometimes miss is this is not the only time that he's mentioned in the Bible. He's also brought up in 2 Kings chapter 14, where we find a story of Jonah is advising the king. Again, as a prophet, he is receiving the word of the Lord, and he is taking it to his people, and he's sharing that message to others. And so he receives a message from the Lord, goes and shares it with the king, and the king uses that information that God has given him and blessed him with so he can go up against their enemy, and he defeats the enemy completely off the information that Jonah gave him. And they were able to expand their region north further than they had ever gone before. And this happened not too long before the story that we're finding here. And through this situation, Jonah has become quite the national hero. Everybody knows who Jonah is. They know how they won this victory. They know he's a man of God. He's riding pretty high on this. He's very much a God and country type of guy. Has a lot of patriotism behind his country as being an Israelite or God's chosen people. Matter of fact, you remember when we talked about the Israelites, one of the big struggles that they had is that they were God's chosen people, so the rest of the world could see the relationship and be drawn to God. But the Israelites said, we're God's chosen people, so we're better than you. You remember us talking about that a few times, probably a few thousand times over the last several years? He's very much in that mix. We're going to find that he has this outlook that challenges what God's about to call him to do. So we're going to dig into his story a little bit, and we're going to start out just, again, right at the beginning. And I think we're going to see that first area we just talked about trip him up a little bit as we see pride come into the life of Jonah the prophet. In verse 1, it says this, "Now the word of the Lord came to Jonah, the son of Amittai, saying, Arise, go to Nineveh, that great city, and call out against it, for their evil has come up before me. But Jonah rose to flee to Tarshish from the presence of the Lord. He went down to Joppa and found a ship going to Tarshish. And so he paid the fare, and he went down into it to go with them to Tarshish, away from the presence of the Lord." I don't think it takes a lot of commentary from Tom. It's not like I did some great search and I found some nugget of truth that I can somehow twist this to make it look like pride. He just has an issue. He has a big issue. And one of the things that is very clear in his story, and the same is true in our lives as well, is whenever we look at another people that might look different than us, or come from a different place than us, or have a different culture than us, or have different finances than us, or smell differently than we do, or look differently than we do, or think differently than we do, whenever we look at that and think that they're lesser, it's racism, it's prejudice, it's sin, it's wrong. There's no place for it in the church. There's no place for it in the Christian. And there's no place for it within the prophet. Jonah's basically saying to God, I really like when you give me these words I can take to my people, to God's chosen people. I like that. I kind of gotten a high from this. I've gotten people looking at me and talking about me. I'm signing autographs at the booth down in the market. I like this. But if you've got a message for somebody else, I'm not your guy. I'm not interested. And he put himself before what God has. Look what God's telling him to do. Go to this great city, this massive city that is sinful, and I'm going to use you to save them. And he's like, no, not them. Not them. And we see that pride leads him into inaction. We see that pride puts him in a place where he's not only not willing to go, but he's willing to go and put himself into a boat, down into the boat, which will have some implications if you ever want to study it when it comes to the story of the great fish coming later. And he goes and completely immerses himself in this plan to go far away from where God is. And not just what God told him to do, but far away from God himself, because he's angry and doesn't want anything to do with it. He wants as far away from God's presence as he can. Pride leads to us saying no to God, pulling away from God. Pride sometimes leads us away from Christian community, and pride oftentimes, if not always, leads us away from what God's calling us to do. He's got great things for us to be a part of, but when I don't want to do it that way becomes our motive, it leads us to some disaster. Well, the story continues, and again, I think you guys are generally aware of this next section here, but I'm going to suggest that this is when we start seeing fear come into the picture that leads to inaction as well. As we continue the testimony in verse 4, it says, "But the Lord hurled a great wind upon the sea." It wasn't just this great story. The Lord literally picked up a great wind and threw it onto the sea, and there was a mighty tempest on the sea, so that the ship threatened to break up. Do you think God gets angry when pride takes us away from him? Right? He threw and hurled this great wind onto the sea, mighty tempest on the sea. The ship is being threatened to break up. The mariners, they were afraid, and each cried out to his own God. And of course, that did no good. And they hurled the cargo that was in the ship into the sea to lighten it for them. And of course, that did no good. But Jonah had gone down into the inner part of the ship and laid down, and he was sleeping. So the captain came and said to him, "What do you mean, you sleeper? Arise, call out to your God. Perhaps the God will give a thought to us that we may not perish." Far too often, we are so comfortable in our pride and inaction that we're resting. Far too often when God's trying to reach out to us, sometimes with whispers, sometimes with a mighty wind, we sit down and we just rest in our inaction. We're comfortable with our pride. We're comfortable with the way things are. I'm safe here. As long as I'm inside the ship, I'm safe here. And God is calling out, reaching out to Jonah, and it continues to get higher and higher, and it's now impacting the people around him. The crew is freaking out. They start trying to figure out what's going on. If you know the story well, they cast lots. It's kind of like a real dice game thing that was kind of in the culture for thousands of years. And the lots fall in such a way that they realize Jonah somehow is the source of the problem. Somehow he's the guy. So he gets called out Keep in mind, in the pride, in the situation, watching the storm, it's not that Jonah stepped up and said, guys, God and I need to have a talk. This is on me. He was still hiding. He was still pulled back. He was still kind of in his stupor. He gets called out. It has something to do with you. What did you do? What's going on with you? How does all this impacting us? And Jonah busted out that it was completely on him, that this is his God, this is his fight. In verse 11, they say to him, in chapter 1, what shall we do to you that the sea may quiet down for us? For the sea grew more and more tempestuous. He said to them, pick me up and hurl me into the sea. Then the sea will quiet down for you, for I know it is because of me that the great tempest has come upon you. If you look at this, we'll see a lot of fear. I mean, we got fear of the sea. We got the guys in the crew freaking out. We got people waking each other up and yelling and trying to figure out what's going on. They're trying to put it all together. They've got a lot of things going on. I'm not talking about that fear when I'm talking about fear leading to inaction. I'm talking about Jonah's fear to lean into what God is calling him to do. If he was in any way, shape, or form doing what we would expect him to do, he would say, guys, this is on me. This is my God. I ran away from him. Give me a rowboat. I'll get into the sea, and I will take myself to Nineveh and do what God told me to do. That's what he should do. That's the obvious response. He's angry because I didn't do what he wanted to do. Let me go do what he told me to do. Instead, he says, I still want nothing to do with that. So just kill me. Just kill me. Just throw me over the boat. I'll die. He'll have his vengeance. You guys can go on and live your lives. He was afraid of having to face God on this mission of things because what God wanted and what Jonah wanted were two separate things altogether. Have you ever realized how much easier it is for us, and I really do believe this for a lot of us, are willing to die for Jesus more so than we are willing to live for Jesus, whatever it takes? You with me on that? I mean, I think all of us kind of think, okay, if there was, God forbid, a church shooting or somebody taking and stepping up against my God, or he put me in that situation, I would want to step up and I would take that hit for Jesus. But taking a tithing, or taking and witnessing to somebody in the break room, or taking and giving up some of my time for this work that God's calling me to do, I can justify that really quick with pride, or I'm kind of afraid of doing that, or what would be the repercussions, or what if I try to do that, work with that mission group and I'm not that good at it? What if leads us to inaction? That fear leads us to inaction. We'll die for him, but living for him seems to be a much bigger struggle for us. There's something about us that wants to be the martyr, right? I'll die for my family. I'll die for my spouse. I'll die for God. But taking and being a living sacrifice 24/7 as God leads us and calls us makes us stumble in fear. And that fear a lot of times leads to an inaction. Well, I think from the story, we're going to get into chapter 2 and chapter 3, and I'm actually going to go into chapter 2 more with you a little bit later. I'm going to kind of jump around a little bit. We get into the story that most of us know. He's thrown into the sea. God's thinking, you moron, I don't want you dead. I want you in Nineveh, the same thing I told you from the very beginning. Sends a great fish. The fish swallows him up, and that's got to be God, right? That's such a huge, weird thing. Anyways, he sucks him in. He has a conversation with God. A lot of that's captured in chapter 2. He finally says, fine, I'll go. God takes the fish. He goes up to the beach. The fish vomits all over the beach. Jonah's part of the vomit. So that you think you have bad days, right? But he's got the algae and the smell or whatever, gets cleaned up. He goes to Nineveh, and he gives this message. This is his sermon. In 40 days, you will face disaster. You will face destruction. In 40 days, you will face destruction. That is not a summary of this 45-minute message that he gives to them. That is all he says to them. Fine, God, I would say this. In 40 days, you will face destruction. They turn from their ways. They lean into God, the God of Jonah's people. There's a great revival that outbreaks, and the entire city is saved. And they are celebrating, and they are worshiping, and everything gets turned upside down on its head. And you would think Jonah would be in the middle of it, finally catching on. At some point, he's like, okay, God pushed me there. I did it. Maybe I did do my best, but God did what he did. Thank you, Jesus, for using me to save this great city and all of these people. Thank you, God, for using me. That is not Jonah's response. That is not Jonah's response. If you look in chapter 4, verse 1, this is what we find is going on with Jonah. It displeased Jonah exceedingly, and he was very angry. And he prayed to the Lord and said, O Lord, is not this what I said when I was yet in my country? That is why I made haste to flee to Tarshish, because I knew that you were a gracious God. I knew you were merciful. I know you were slow to anger. I know you were abounding in steadfast love and relenting from disaster. Therefore now, O Lord, please take my life from me, for it is better for me to die than to live. How messed up we get. I'm going to suggest to you that this is the symptoms of lust. I want what I want. Here's the whole reason I didn't want to go, God, is because I had a feeling that you were going to be good. I wanted them dead. I wanted justice. I wanted holy justice. I wanted the fire and the brimstone. I wanted, some Sodom and Gomorrah action going here. I don't like these people. They're not my people. You don't even call them your chosen people. I wanted them destroyed. I wanted to be able to point at and say to my people, see, that's what happens when we don't follow. See, look at them. Look how good we got. Look at them. You keep following what I say, what God brings to me. You keep following what the king's doing through my counsel, and we'll be fine. That's what I wanted. I had a feeling you were going to be nice to them, and I hate it. I wanted what I wanted, and I didn't care or want to relent to what you wanted, God, is what led him to inaction. To the point that when the celebration was going on around him, he was missing it 100% because he was sitting up on the hillside, ticked off, angry, and in bondage. I love verse 4. The Lord said to him, this is right after Jonah says this part, the Lord said back, do you do well to be angry? And I'll tell you, brother and sister, I've read this a billion times over. A billion times over. And you know how the Holy Spirit gives you new things all the time? I love how the Spirit does that. This is the first time that phrase jumped out at me at that level. When we get locked up in our pride and our fear and our lust, and it doesn't go the way we want it to, and we start getting mad and we start getting upset, God is sitting there listening to us go on or watching us take and pull away and say, so how's that anger working out for you? Holy cow. When we find ourselves pulled away from Christian community and we find ourselves mad at what God's doing, do you do well to be angry? Now listen, I've still somehow inside my head see myself as a young man. And I know I'm not old, but I'm not still that 30-year-old kid that was just getting into ministry. You know what I mean? I'm kind of getting into that middle age of things. And it weirds me out. To me, I still look in the mirror and go, where did that gray hair come from, right? Or you always think you're younger. Or you try to be cool in front of your kids and it never works, right? You kind of have that image about yourself and it never really happens. I know I'm not, I've been doing ministry for 50 years. But I've been doing ministry for 30 years. I've been doing church ministry for 20 years. And I will say this from my experience. I've seen time and time again, not just in my own life, but in other people's lives, where these three things bring disaster. I have seen many times over, now I'll bring it down to just the last 14 years here at the Shepherd's Fellowship, where people I love and adore, love being in the church, are doing great ministry, not just within the church, but within the mission fields outside of the church, have great relationships, I'll come up and I'll talking about the sermon, talking about the worship, talking about the Bible study, talking about the home group, talking about all these things, and then something shifts at some point where the Spirit doesn't move here anymore. I get nothing out of the sermons. The worship does nothing for me. It doesn't feel the way that it used to. I don't have as many close friends as I used to. They start pulling away from people. They start getting locked up. They start complaining about everything that they see happening within the church. A lot of times that I see that, And then I look at everybody else in the church, everybody else is going, God's moving through the messages, God's moving through the worship, God's moving through the community, I'm making new friends, I'm finding new life and everything. When you look at that, at some point you have to say, is there something that we can do to help you with that? But is there something going on inside of you that's blocking the Spirit? Is there anger, pride, fear, lust? Is there anger? And God looks in our hearts and says, how is that anger working out for you? Because we live in a culture that has churches all around us, and we can be as consumeristic as we want to. There are churches that have better preachers than me in this community. There's churches that have more resources than we do. There's churches that have bigger bands than we do. There's a lot of options out there. So if we can just kind of get to the point that it doesn't feel like it used to and keep jumping, you're going to find a new church family every 3 years when the honeymoon period wears off. Let alone you're not serving and growing and maturing and reaching the community the way God calls us to. Those are things we really have to watch for. Any area of our life where God is trying to reach us and we're taking and trying to put our hands up. Where He's trying to lead us forward and we're trying to pull back. Jonah is an incredible story of the challenges that come into place. So, the question becomes, what's the big deal? So Jonah missed it. God still had His way. Nineveh's still saved. Why do we have to care? Because you and I are Jonah. We're the ones that are called to be part of His bigger plan. I'll just give you this hint. God wins, right? You all remember Revelation? Right? God wins. I sure would like to be a part of it, though. And I'd like to be the fullness, most free part of that I can. I would love to be able to go home someday, as Mike was talking about earlier. I've seen many people say that there probably wasn't a bigger celebration than when Billy Graham came into heaven. I take a little note with that because I think his was huge, and I think there's probably a lot of huge celebrations from people I've never heard their name as well. But when that day comes and I come into the presence of my God, and my great-grandmother's there, and Billy Graham is there, and all these people have gone ahead, I sure would love to be able to come in saying, I didn't get on that boat. I didn't hide from the storm. I didn't go up on the hillside from a distance and pout. But God, what you did was just a few simple yeses. Wow. Look at all the time that Jonah, we condense it into like a few pages here, but look at all the time he wasted. Look at all the struggle that he went through. Look at the testimony that he could have been part of, but he blew. Man, did you hear what happened over at Nineveh? It was incredible. Yeah, I was there. What was your part? Oh, I was the guy that said the one sentence and then went up on the hillside and pouted before God. Wow, can you come meet my wife? You know what I mean? Like the difference is, the big deal is because we waste so much time and so much emotion and so much pain into areas that steal from us. So with the help of Sarah, I'm going to put up some of the areas that we have talked about that we've seen impact by the monsters that we have studied over the last few weeks. We have seen with the bordering country of Judah that they were letting their brothers and sisters stumble instead of being a community, a family that would stand up for one another, that would encourage one another, that would sharpen one another, that would speak into each other's lives, that would take and pray for one another or hug into one another, that they were holding on to anger and a grudge. That we found that situation came because of a bowl of soup 2,000 years before, and that they had that half-filled McCoy situation, but they would not let go of that grudge. They never let go of that jealousy that put them into such a horrible spot. That they would have fear of the enemy attacks, and that fear of the enemy attacks would stop the community from taking and going after what God wanted or what God's presence was in their lives. We've seen that they would focus on their own house instead of the temple, which was their primary goal. The whole reason they went back was to rebuild the temple, but because of the tax, they built houses of royalty for themselves and did not touch the temple for 20 years. And then God stepped in and said, wait, I just want to make sure I'm understanding. It's not time for you to do what I called you to do. It's time for you to do your own thing. Is that what I'm hearing? We saw that they can lead them into places of lust, of comfort, and riches, and the judgment came against them because they would not take of what God had entrusted to them to help people that were in need or people that were struggling. They wanted to keep it for themselves for their own comfort. We find that they were dealing with idol worship, and anytime we put anything before God, it's idol worship. Whether, again, that be the big three of our finances and time and resources, or that be our own wants and desires, with pride taking and putting us into a place of sin by putting ourselves in front of God. We looked at, they were dealing with the struggle of creating a personal truth, where they were taking and pulling from different religions the things that they liked or the beliefs that they liked, and then adding their own worldly logic into it as well and saying, this is my truth. And people will be like, oh, that's good. If that's your truth, this is my truth. It's different. But as long as that works for you, that's fine. Things that we see in the world all the time, that we see because of pride, and we see because of fear, and we see because of lust. And my guess is, because I know how the Spirit is, and my guess is because some of you have told me, and my guess is because I've seen some changes in some people's lives in different areas that they were struggling with before, and maybe still struggling with, but finding some new freedom, is that as we talked about these things, a lot of us had things put on our hearts that we knew needed addressed. A lot of us had things put on our hearts that we knew were not right. Areas where we were saying no to God, not wanting to be obedient to God, not wanting to move forward. And a lot of us said prayers, and a lot of us have made new decisions. And like I said, the thing I celebrate is I see some people taking some new steps. I hear people talking about the struggle and the fears that come from it as well, and how they're wrestling with it, or having conversations at home about it, or talking to their friends about it. And I'd be willing to bet that some of us had a moment and then went right back to the way it was. Or some of us had something so depressed on our heart and we blocked it. I'd be willing to bet. This sermon series, of course, doesn't stand on its own. If you've been coming to the fellowship for a long time, you know that we usually do studies in series because we like to dig in deep. And usually no series is of its own. Usually it's just built off of something and it leads to something else. Not because I'm all that crafty, but just because we're following the flow of the Spirit, and it seems to work out that way. So in this series, as we came up to it, if we go to the next screen here, we're going to find that this came out of a sermon series that we did in January, where we talked about the mission of the church. And we talked about how awesome it is that God calls us to be passionately involved in leading people to Jesus. That God calls us to be passionately involved in baptizing people. That He calls us to be intimately involved in discipling one another and reaching out to the community around us and taking and reaching within the community that He's given us through our local body church. And we looked at the vision and the passion of being an authentic community. And I think that God has taken us through a season of change in our authentic community. I really do believe that, and I think we're going to see changes. I see new people getting excited about community. I see others who doesn't feel like it used to anymore. I see growing Wednesday night. We had 3 full tables of people here, and we had the full youth room, and we have new relationships being built. And I'm seeing new people hang out with each other and talk with each other. New people make a passion. I'm excited about that authentic community, even though I do think He's taking us through some transition. Which in the flesh, to be honest, somewhat makes me nervous, but in the Spirit, you go, God, you know? But to be authentic community, to be people of faith, to be people displaying hope, to be people doing tangible acts of love, to take and go through those core values that we dug into. And if you remember, we used the 2 examples of serving and financial faithfulness to be able to go through those core values. All of those things we talked about, and I really wanted to launch into, and if you're going back 4 weeks, you'll remember this, talking about an outward focus. Let's take this mission, let's take this vision, let's take these core values and just go impact the community around us. And if you remember, I shared with you, I think I really feel the Spirit said, not yet. That some of us were taking and sitting deep in rest, deep in our boats, and just needed to listen to the Spirit a little bit. But we are moving there next week. We are moving outward. We are moving out to talk about some things as far as impacting the community around us and what God has for us through His Word there. But today, I really hope and pray, as we've been up against this before, that we just stop, we listen, and we obey. And we kill and let go of any of these monsters that have been keeping us in inaction. Because God has better for you. He has better through you. And you want to be part of that testimony. One of the quotes that came up this past week, if you remember, on Friday, we hosted a Simon Cast conference called Woken as Worship. And one of the speakers said something that I think was pretty powerful. And I think I even put it out on Facebook. But there's a gentleman named Tom Nelson. I'd never heard of this gentleman before. But he shared the thought, to be faithful, we must also be fruitful. And I think that's a good invitation to do some self-evaluation as we come into prayer. To be faithful, we must also be fruitful. I think that's a good observation as we come into a time of communion. We don't do works to get saved, but if you're saved, by golly, shouldn't there be fruit? I'm going to ask Katie to come forward, and she's going to, thank you, Katie, play some music, and we're going to prepare ourselves for a time of communion. I really can't imagine a better way for us to respond to what the Spirit's been doing than for us as a community to take of the cup, to take of the bread together. But I want to give you a few moments to prepare your hearts for communion. It's not something that we just come to lightly, or it's not just a tradition that we dig into it. We're coming to the Lord's table, and we're remembering the sacrifice that He has given and the victory that He has won, so that we can have community, that we can have purpose, that we can have passion. And we will take that in a few moments. Like I said, I want to give you some personal prayer. So if we would, let's just start out with the word of prayer. I want to give you some time. I'll get us started. I'll give you some time to speak with your Father. And as we get to the end of that time, I'm going to read over you Jonah chapter 2. It's simply his prayer. Again, we saw that he struggled before, and they struggled after. But it was his prayer. It was his heart. Again, our hearts usually come to the Lord a little bit quicker than our actions do. And I think it's a beautiful heart, and I want to encourage you with what he has to share. At the end of reading that prayer, we will start to serve the communion. And we're not going to take a Stephen Fund collection this week. I don't feel that that's part of what we're to do. That's a tradition. It's not biblically mandated. I just really want to have this time between the Spirit, you, and your church community. And then we'll take of the cup and we'll take of the bread as a celebration and as a commitment as we lean into our purpose. Dear Heavenly Father, I pray that you just move in this place the way that you have been moving. And I pray that your Spirit speaks. And I pray that your children hear. And I pray that you invade our hearts and our minds, our plans and our ways. And that you start to illuminate maybe what you have already illuminated before. Maybe what we've already come to your throne about before. Or maybe it's something fresh and new. For some, maybe it's so new that we have not ever leaned into you as leader and forgiver in our lives. That we have never given you control. We might know a lot about you. We might know the story of Jonah frontwards and backwards because of all the days growing up in church or VBS. But we have never given ourselves to you. Will you shine a light on that in this moment? Because one of the things that we know through Jonah's story as well is you can be as messed up and wicked as Nineveh. But if you heed the warning and the invitation of your God, And you accept Jesus by acknowledging with your mouth He's the Son of God, and believing in your heart He died and rose again, and follow Him, that like the great city of Nineveh, you will be saved. A new beginning, a new purpose, a new start, a new celebration. And for others of us, wherever we fall on the spectrum of things, if there's an area where we have been locked up in anger or fear, lust or pride, and we've been sitting on the sidelines, we've been sitting on the hillside, if we've been sitting off the side going, I can do that better, I knew better, if they would just do it my way, if God would just see things my way, and maybe God today is trying to just say to you, how's that working out? Because He's not saying it to be snide or to try to put you in some kind of punishment place, but to just simply say, I've got better. If that's not working for you, I've got better. Will you lean into that invitation today? Will you take some time and talk to Him about these things? Release some things. Give up some things. Let Him destroy some things with the power of the cross. Father, we come.